The steamship Perseverance plowed through the churning waves of the North Atlantic, its brass and iron hull creaking under the strain of the relentless storm. The skies were a tumultuous gray, and rain lashed the decks as the crew battled to keep the ship on course. Among them was old Ben, a seasoned sailor with a grizzled beard and a lifetime of sea stories etched into the lines of his withered face. In the heart of the storm, a sudden jolt rocked the ship, and a cry of alarm went up. Ben's keen ears caught the sound of rushing water coming from below. He grabbed a lantern and made his way to the engine room, his heart sinking as he descended the narrow, slippery steps. The sight that greeted him confirmed his worst fears. Seawater was pouring in through a breach in the hull, flooding the engine room. The great steam engines, the heart and soul of the Perseverance, were at risk of being extinguished by the encroaching water. "Captain," Ben shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm and the hiss of steam. The engine room's flooding. Captain Harris and the first mate, Mr. Thompson, arrived swiftly, their faces grim as they surveyed the situation. The crew gathered around, fear and uncertainty in their eyes. "We need to seal the engine room to stop the flooding," Captain Harris said, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "But we can't abandon the engines. Someone has to stay and keep them running, or we'll lose power and be at the mercy of the storm." A tense silence fell over the group. Everyone knew what staying behind meant. It was a death sentence. The crew exchanged glances, no one willing to volunteer for the grim task. Old Ben watched them, his heart aching for the young sailors, many of whom had families waiting for them back home. He had lived a long, full life, and though he loved the sea, he knew his time was nearing an end. He had no family left, no one to mourn him. It was an easy decision. As the crew debated their options, Ben quietly slipped away, moving with surprising swiftness for a man of his age. He made his way back to the engine room and stepped inside, closing the heavy iron door behind him. He turned the wheel, sealing himself in, and locked it tight. He picked up a shovel and began to feed coal into the roaring furnaces, his movements steady and practiced. The engines roared to life, their rhythm a comforting thrum amidst the chaos. He could feel the water rising around his ankles, but he focused on his task, determined to give the crew every possible chance of survival. Time seemed to stretch and blur as Ben worked tirelessly, shoveling coal with a relentless, unwavering determination. The water continued to rise, creeping up his legs, but he ignored the cold bite of the seawater. He kept the flames fed, the engines alive, and the ship powered. Above deck, the storm raged on, but the Perseverance held its course, its engines pushing it forward through the maelstrom. The crew worked with renewed vigor, inspired by the unseen hero below. Minutes turned into hours, and Ben's strength began to wane. The water was up to his chest now, the flames flickering as the seawater encroached upon the furnaces. Still, he kept shoveling, his hands numb, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As the last shovelful of coal was consumed by the hungry flames, the water finally rose too high, smothering the fire with a final, hissing gasp. The engine sputtered and fell silent, the ship coasting on the last remnants of its momentum. Above deck, the crew felt the change, their hearts sinking. But then, as if in response to their desperate prayers, the storm began to break. The clouds parted, and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the gloom, casting a golden light over the battered ship. "Ben!" Captain Harris shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We need to check on Ben." The crew rushed to the engine room, their footsteps echoing through the now quiet corridors. They reached the sealed door and peered through the porthole, their breath catching in their throats. Inside, they saw old Ben, the shovel still clutched in his hands. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep. Captain Harris bowed his head, tears streaming down his face. "He saved us," he whispered. The crew stood in solemn silence, paying their respects to the old sailor who had become their savior. As the Perseverance drifted towards calmer waters, the sun rose higher, bathing the ship in a warm, golden light.